On the night of the 21st of October, 1944, somewhere in a rain-soaked field in Belgium, a 31-year-old army nurse named Frances Slanger could not sleep. The guns had been quiet for a few days. The field hospital had moved again. It was always moving, always one step behind the fighting and one step ahead of the chaos. And the 4 nurses sharing her tent had finally fallen into the kind of deep, exhausted sleep that field hospital personnel learn to take whenever the opportunity briefly presents itself. Frances lay still for an hour, listening to them breathe. Then she got up, wrapped herself against the cold, sat down with a flashlight and a sheet of paper, and began to write. She wrote a letter. Not to her family, not to a friend back home, not to the doctor she had come to care for deeply over the preceding months of following the same war across North Africa and Sicily and Italy and France and into Belgium. She wrote to the soldiers, to the men she was there to care for, the men who had been coming into her ward for months, bloody and dirty, and so tired that some of them simply closed their eyes as they were carried in, and she sometimes could not tell in those first seconds whether they were sleeping or something worse. She wanted to tell them something, not what they might have expected a nurse to say, not the professional reassurance of someone whose job required optimism. She wanted to say the honest thing. The thing she had been thinking for months while she dressed their wounds and held their hands and wrote their letters home when their hands were too broken or too still to hold a pen themselves. She wrote for 2 hours in the dark. When she was finished, she showed the letter to the other nurses in the morning, and they told her to send it to Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper. So she did. She dropped it in the mail on the morning of the 21st of October, 1944. That afternoon, a German artillery shell struck her field hospital. Frances Slanger died of shrapnel wounds to the abdomen later that same day, becoming the only American nurse to be killed by enemy action in the European theater of the entire war. She never knew her letter had been published. She never knew it had been read by thousands of soldiers who wrote back in numbers that overwhelmed the editors of the paper. She never knew that the United States Army had commissioned a hospital ship in her name, or that 1,000 people, including the mayor of Boston, had stood in the November rain to receive her body when it was finally brought home 3 years after the war ended. She only knew what she had written down in that tent, and what she had written down was a letter that could only have come from someone who had spent months sitting by the bedsides of men who were dying, holding a pen, listening to what they could not say to anyone else. This is her story, and the story of every woman who sat in a field hospital ward with a sheet of paper and a pen and became for a few hours the voice of a man who could no longer speak for himself. To understand what Frances Slanger was doing in a field hospital in Belgium in October of 1944, you have to go back to where she began. Because where she began explains almost everything about why she was there, and why the letter she wrote in that tent said what it said. She was born Friedel Jachet Schlanger in the city of Lodz in what was then Russian-controlled Poland in 1913. Her father, Abraham, had already left for America at the time she was born, and Friedel grew up with her mother in Lodz during the First World War, a city under occupation in a country that was simultaneously a battlefield, a refugee crisis, and an ongoing demonstration of what happens to civilians when major powers fight their wars across someone else's geography. She was 7 years old when the family finally reunited in Boston, and her name was changed at the immigration office to Frances Slanger, which was close enough to what it had been. The family settled in Roxbury, Massachusetts. Her father sold fruit from a cart. Frances grew up understanding 2 things about the world that would shape everything that came after them: that her family had almost nothing, and that the difference between having nothing and having slightly more was usually the presence of someone who decided to help. She wanted to be a nurse from an early age, with the particular clarity of purpose that sometimes comes from watching people suffer and deciding you will not look away. She enrolled in the Boston City Hospital School of Nursing, working alongside her studies, and graduated in 1937. She was not at the top of her class. She was not especially remarkable in her technical training, and her supervisor's assessments of her student performance were, by the historical record, competent rather than exceptional. What was exceptional, what everyone who knew her would later describe in terms that went beyond the clinical, was the quality of her attention to the person in the bed. She did not treat the wound, she treated the man, or the woman, or whoever was lying there. She treated the human being, and she understood in a way that distinguished her from other nurses who were technically her equals that the human being and the wound were not the same thing, and treating the wound without treating the person was, in a specific and important way, an incomplete job. By 1940, the war in Europe was producing the kind of news that a woman who had been born in Lodz, whose family had fled across an ocean to escape what was happening to Jewish people in exactly the places she had grown up, could not read without feeling the specific pull of personal responsibility. Frances enlisted in the Army Nurse Corps in 1943. She requested deployment to Europe. The Army, with its customary institutional logic, sent her to Fort Devens, Massachusetts, instead. She requested Europe again. The Army eventually relented. On the 10th of June, 1944, 4 days after the Normandy landings, Frances Slanger waded ashore in the surf near the beaches, one of the first 4 military nurses to enter Normandy. She was wearing a 3-pound helmet and Army fatigues, and she walked up the beach past equipment and wreckage and the evidence of everything that had happened there 4 days earlier. At the top of the beach, there were already hundreds of wounded men waiting for her. A field hospital in the Second World War was not the institution that the word hospital suggests to anyone who has only experienced hospitals in peacetime. It was a tent, or more accurately, a collection of tents, sited on whatever flat and accessible ground was available, a cow pasture more often than not, or a hay field, or a muddy stretch of farmland with a road close enough for the ambulances to reach it. The tents leaked when it rained, which in northern Europe in the autumn and winter was most of the time. The floors were whatever the ground underneath them happened to be, mud primarily, sometimes covered with duckboards if the engineers had time and supplies, sometimes covered with nothing at all. Everything smelled of antiseptic and canvas and the cold, and underneath those smells, the other smell that anyone who has worked in a trauma ward in a time of mass casualties will recognize immediately and never quite forget. The nurses who worked in these hospitals worked 12-hour shifts as a standard arrangement, and worked longer than that routinely because the standard arrangement assumed a supply of patients that was orderly and predictable, and the reality was neither. When a major engagement was underway nearby, the ambulances arrived in a continuous stream. The triage decisions were made fast. The surgical team operated until they ran out of patients or ran out of the ability to continue standing, whichever came first. The nurses on the ward managed what came out of surgery and what came in from the ambulances simultaneously, monitoring vital signs, administering plasma and morphine, watching the patients the surgeons had stabilized, and watching the ones who were not going to be stable regardless of what anyone did. Frances Slanger was assigned to the 45th Field Hospital. Over the following months, the 45th moved as the campaign moved, through Normandy, through France, into Belgium, always following the fighting at the distance that a field hospital could function, close enough to receive casualties quickly, far enough back that the risk of direct fire was, in theory, manageable. In practice, theory and reality had a complicated relationship. The women of the 45th set up their tents in fields they could hear artillery from. They moved on a few days later and set up again somewhere else. What Frances Slanger and her fellow nurses learned in those months of following the war through the French and Belgian countryside was something that cannot be taught and cannot be prepared for. They learned what it meant to be the last American woman a man would ever see. Not in a dramatic or theatrical sense, in a completely plain and practical one. The men who came into the ward at the 45th Field Hospital had, in many cases, not seen an American woman in months, in some cases a year or more. The specific human comfort of a familiar face, a face that belonged to the same country, the same language, the same world they had grown up in, was not a trivial thing in the wards of a field hospital. It was one of the specific tools that the nurses had, and they used it deliberately, with full awareness of what it was doing. Frances June, a surgical nurse who served in the same theater through the same campaigns, wrote in her diary about an 18-year-old boy carried into the shock ward who looked up at her trustingly and asked, "How am I doing, nurse?" And she wrote down what she had answered, and the answer was the professional answer, the compassionate answer, the answer that gave him the comfort the moment required. She wrote that she kissed his forehead and told him he was doing just fine. He smiled, she wrote, sweetly, and said he was just checking, and then he died. She wrote, "We all cry in private, but not in front of the boys." That specific management of private and public, the maintenance in the presence of patients of a composure that was not dishonesty, but discipline, was one of the most demanding aspects of the nurse's work, and one of the least visible to anyone who was not doing it. It cost something. It cost something every time, and the accounts of the nurses who did this work are full of the ways they found to discharge the cost when they were finally alone. The diaries written by flashlight in the dark, the letters home, the specific camaraderie of women who were the only people who understood what they were each carrying, and who took care of each other with the same quiet care they took care of the men. There was a specific service that Frances Slanger and every other nurse in every field hospital provided that almost never appears in the histories of the war, and that is the service this story is really about. When a soldier came into a ward with his hands bound in dressings, or with his arms immobilized, or with injuries that made the simple act of holding a pen impossible, or when he was too weak from blood loss or surgery to sit up, or when he simply could not find the words on his own, there was a nurse who sat down beside him and picked up the pen and asked him what he wanted to say. And then she wrote it down. This was not a formal program, not a system with its own name and its own organizational structure in the way that the Gray Ladies of the Red Cross were organized and named and uniformed. It was simply what nurses did, in the spaces between the clinical work, in the moments when the urgent had been attended to, and what remained was the human. A nurse with a few minutes between patients, sitting down on the edge of a cot, asking a man whether there was someone he wanted to write to, a pencil, a sheet of paper from whatever supply was available, the question, "What do you want to say?" The answers to that question were as varied as the men who gave them, and they ranged across a spectrum of human need that in its breadth and its specificity is one of the more remarkable documents of what soldiers actually felt in the wards of field hospitals. Some of the answers were simple and practical. Tell my mother I am all right. Tell her I am being well taken care of. Reassurance was the most common request, the desire to prevent the people at home from worrying, expressed even by men whose condition was a very long way from all right. The nurses wrote those letters, and they did so with care, staying as close to the truth as the circumstances allowed, which sometimes meant staying close to a truth that was more optimistic than the medical reality strictly warranted. Some of the answers were more complicated. There were men who needed to say things to their families that they had not been able to say before the war, things that the proximity of their own mortality had made suddenly urgent and suddenly possible in a way that they had not been before. A soldier who had not spoken to his father in 3 years because of a quarrel that seemed important before the war and did not seem important anymore. A man who needed to tell his wife something he had been carrying for months, something that could not wait any longer. A soldier who dictated a letter to his parents that was, in its shape and its emotional directness, a goodbye, though no one in the letter said that word. The nurses who wrote these letters were doing something that required a specific and unusual combination of qualities. They needed to listen accurately and without judgment, because what a man dictated in a field hospital ward was often not what he would have said with more time and more distance, and the accuracy was sacred. It was his words going to his people, not the nurse's version of his words. They needed to be present without being intrusive, available without pressing, warm without being sentimental in a way that would embarrass a man trying to communicate something serious, and they needed to hold everything they heard and saw and wrote in a kind of private custody that did not leak, that stayed between the man and the page and the person the page was going to, without becoming the nurse's story to tell. Most of what was dictated in those wards was never shared publicly by anyone. The nurses understood what they were holding. They held it accordingly. If the idea of women sitting in field hospital wards with a pen, writing down the final things that men needed to say, is the kind of story that deserves a wider audience, subscribe. It genuinely helps these stories find the people who want them. Because what those women were carrying and what it cost them to carry it is the part of this story that the history books almost never reach. It is worth dwelling on what was actually in those letters, because the content of what soldiers asked nurses to write for them is one of the clearest records available of what men in extremity actually felt, which was not, for the most part, what the public image of wartime heroism suggested they felt. They felt afraid. Not consistently, not continuously, not in the overwhelming and paralyzing way that would have prevented them from functioning in the first place, but afraid, in the specific way that a young man feels when he is lying in a cot and does not yet know whether what has been done to his body is something that is going to return to him or something that has taken things permanently. The letters that nurses wrote for men in that state are often letters about fear that has been rephrased as love. The fear for the family, the fear of not returning, the fear of leaving things unsaid, expressed not as fear directly, but the urgent and specific need to say the thing that the fear of not saying it was making urgent. They asked for forgiveness, more often than anyone who has not been in those wards would expect. A thing that had happened in England before the invasion, a thing he had been carrying for months, a thing that was pressing on him with the specific weight of the unconfessed, and that he needed to put somewhere outside himself before whatever came next. The nurses wrote what they were asked to write. They did not editorialize. They did not offer absolution or judgment. They wrote it down in the man's words and sealed the envelope and put it in the mail. They asked for practical things, which were themselves a form of love. The location of the insurance policy, the name of the lawyer in town who had drawn up the will, the routing number for the bank account that the wife did not know about because he had always managed the finances and she would need it, the name of the neighbor who had always helped with the furnace, and the specific instruction that she should not try to do it herself. These letters are the documentation of men who understood, in the wards of field hospitals, that the people they were going home to, or might not be going home to, would have to continue without them, and who wanted, with whatever time and clarity they had, to make that continuation as manageable as possible. And they asked for the simplest things of all, which were the most overwhelming. Tell her I love her. Tell them I think about them every day. Tell my mother not to worry. These requests were often given in voices that were controlled until the very end of the sentence, and then were not, and the nurse who was writing them down received the end of the sentence in whatever form it arrived. Virginia McMaster Ford, a Red Cross nurse who described her work in a letter home, wrote that her role was to ease home troubles of any nature, and that phrase, ease home troubles, contains a universe of specific human need. The trouble of not knowing, the trouble of the thing left unsaid, the trouble of the distance between the cot in Belgium and the kitchen table in Ohio, where someone was sitting tonight, not knowing what was happening in that cot in Belgium. The nurse with the pen was the thing that reduced the distance for the few minutes she was writing to something that felt like a room you could reach across. There were things that some men asked nurses to write that required a specific negotiation between honesty and protection, and the nurses who were asked to navigate that negotiation were navigating it without any training or preparation, on the basis of nothing but their own judgment and their own understanding of what was being asked. A man who knew he was dying, who had been told or who understood from the evidence of his own body that he was not going to leave the ward in the direction of recovery, sometimes wanted to write a letter that acknowledged this, and sometimes wanted to write a letter that did not. The decision was his, and the nurse's job was to write what he decided. But the decision was not always simple, and the process of arriving at it sometimes required more from the nurse than simply picking up a pen. There were soldiers who wanted to write goodbye letters while telling their families it was not a goodbye letter, who wanted to say the things you say when you know you are dying in language that would allow the recipient to understand when the time came and the telegram arrived what the letter had really meant, without forcing the recipient into that understanding before the time came. The architecture of these letters was complex, and the nurses who wrote them were writing, in some cases, a kind of code that they helped the soldier construct. There were soldiers who needed to confess things, not to a priest, though the chaplains were present and available, and some men asked for them first and the letter second, but to the person at home, to the wife who did not know something, to the parents who believed something about their son that was not quite accurate. The confessions varied. Some of them were small, some of them were not small, and the nurse writing them down sat with information that she would carry for the rest of her life, because the seal of a confided thing does not expire when the letter is sealed. And there were soldiers who did not know what they wanted to say, who knew only that they needed to say something and could not find it, and who sat in a kind of anguished silence while the nurse held the pen and waited. The waiting was its own skill, the ability to remain present with someone who is struggling to find the words they need without rushing them or filling the silence prematurely. This is not a natural skill for most people, and most of the nurses who developed it entirely by doing it, in wards where they could not afford to practice. June Wandry wrote in her diary about the men who simply wanted her to stay, not to write, not to treat, not to do anything clinical, just to stay, to be a person in the bed's vicinity who was not going to leave until the soldiers said they could go. She wrote about sitting by cots for long stretches after her shift had technically ended, because the man in the cot had not released her and she had not been able to go, and the thing that held her in the chair was not obligation, but something more personal and more difficult to name. Frances Slanger wrote in her letter that the wounded did not cry. It is a line that sounds, in isolation, like a testament to courage, and it was that, but it was also an observation about the specific way that men in pain manage themselves when they are being watched. The nurses in those wards saw what happened when the visitors left and the lights went down. The crying in private that Wandry described was not only the nurses crying, it was the men's as well, the thing that came out when the required composure was finally no longer required. The nurse with the pen was often the last person the man let himself be seen by before the night came. The women who did this work carried it. That sentence requires the space to land, because the carrying was not metaphorical. It was specific, accumulated, and in many cases, permanent. The nurses of the field hospitals, the army nurses, the Red Cross volunteers, the gray ladies who wrote letters and sat by beds in the military hospitals back home, were doing work that had no established framework for its psychological cost, because the cost had never been named as a cost in any official sense. They were volunteers and professionals who had chosen a caring role, and the assumption was that caring people were suited to caring work, and that the work, however difficult, was the natural domain of the people doing it. What was not acknowledged, what would not be acknowledged in any systematic institutional way for decades, was that the accumulation of other people's extremity, absorbed day after day in the specific intimacy of a better afterward. The nurse who sat with a man while he confessed something to his wife carried the confession. The nurse who held the pen while a soldier said goodbye without saying goodbye carried the specific architecture of that goodbye. May Bradford, a volunteer letter writer who served in British hospitals in the First World War and wrote more than 25,000 letters for wounded and dying soldiers across 4.5 years, published a memoir of the experience that is one of the most honest first-person accounts available of what sustained exposure to other people's final words actually does to the person who receives them. She described something that she was not able to name with any precision, a kind of layering, an accumulation of other people's private moments that sat in her differently from ordinary memory. The letters she had written were not her letters, the things she had heard were not her things, but they were in her, and they remained. The nurses of the Second World War did not, for the most part, write memoirs. The culture of the period was not particularly encouraging of women who described the emotional cost of professional work, and the Army Nurse Corps had its own specific culture of composure and capability that did not leave much room for the publicly acknowledged expression of what carrying this work felt like. They wrote diaries, some of them. They wrote letters home that occasionally let the surface crack enough to show what was underneath. June Wandry's diary, which she later published as Bedpan Commando, is the most sustained and most honest first-person account available, and it shows a woman who maintained her humor and her affection and her fierce loyalty to the men she was treating throughout the entire campaign, and who was also, by the end of it, changed in ways that she described with the directness of someone who had decided to leave an honest record. She wrote in one of the later diary entries that it didn't pay to dwell on the present too much, because it was all pain and hardship and sleepless nights and lots of young men dying miserably or fighting to keep from dying. She wrote it without self-pity and without drama. She wrote it the way you write down something that is simply true and that you have decided to write down rather than leave unwritten. That is the register of almost all the nursing testimony from this period. Not complaint, not breakdown, not the language of trauma that a later generation would develop for what they were describing, just the plain statement of what it was. Pain, hardship, sleepless nights, young men dying. The job of being present for all of it, every day, with a pen in hand when a pen was what was needed. If what these women carried, what they absorbed and held and wrote down and kept with them for the rest of their lives feels like a cost that deserves to be acknowledged, subscribe. That is what this channel exists to do. Now let's follow Frances into the tent on the last night of her life and find out what she wrote. On the night of October 21st, 1944, Frances Slanger lay awake in her tent near Elsenborn, Belgium, listening to the rain. The rain was hard. The wind was moving the tent in the way that it did on bad nights, making the canvas breathe and rattle against the poles. The fire in the small stove had burned low. She had been awake for an hour, she wrote later, thinking about the conversations of that day, what they had talked about, the other nurses and herself, in the brief spaces between the work. Then she got up, built the fire back, and sat down to write by flashlight. She had been provoked, she later explained in the letter itself, by articles that had been appearing in various American magazines and newspapers, written by grateful soldiers praising the nurses. She wanted to respond to those articles, not to deflect the gratitude, though the letter does that gently and firmly, but to redirect it, to point it at the men who had earned it, the men in the cots, the men whose wounds she had been dressing for 4 months, and to say what she had been accumulating the evidence for, and had finally found the language to express. What she wrote was not a polished piece of writing. It was a letter written at 2 in the morning by a tired woman sitting by a fire in a rain-beaten tent, and it reads exactly like that, with the digressions and the running thoughts and the small observations that come from a mind that is not composing so much as speaking. She described the fire as being like a human being. If you don't let it run too low, and there is a spark left, it can be nursed back. She said that was what they did in the field hospitals, all the time. She said they waded ankle-deep in mud. She said the men had to lie in it. And then she said the thing she had gotten up to say, that she and the other nurses did not deserve the praise they were receiving, not because they had not earned it, but because the men they were caring for had earned something larger. She described what the men looked like when they came into the ward, bloody, dirty with the earth, mud and grime, most of them so tired. She described seeing them gradually brought back to life, to consciousness. She wrote about the specific moment when a man's lips separated into a grin when he first saw a nurse, when he opened his eyes and understood where he was and what he usually said. The words were exactly what you would expect from a young American man who had been in the field for months and had just found himself in the presence of an American woman for the first time in a long time. "Hiya, babe." She wrote, "We have learned a great deal about our American boy and the stuff he is made of." She wrote, "The wounded do not cry." She wrote, "Their buddies come first." And then she wrote, "It is we who are proud of you." She sealed the letter. She showed it to the other nurses in the morning, who read it and told her to send it. She dropped it in the mail at some point on the morning of the 21st. That afternoon, in the quiet that had settled over the area around Elsenborn, a German artillery shell burst somewhere near the field hospital. The official accounts describe it as a sudden and unexpected barrage. 3 people were killed. Frances Slanger died of her wounds. She was 31 years old. At the Paris office of Stars and Stripes, the editors received Frances Slanger's letter in the days after her death. They did not know she was dead. They read the letter, decided it was extraordinary, and published it not as a reader's submission, but as an editorial, the position in the newspaper reserved for the considered opinion of the paper itself, the place where the most significant statements went. The letter appeared on the editorial page on the 7th of November, 1944. It ran without significant editing. The editors added a note identifying the author as a nurse with the 45th Field Hospital. What happened next has been described by the journalists and historians who researched it afterward as an unprecedented response. The letter provoked more reader mail than anything Stars and Stripes had previously published. Soldiers who read it wrote back, some of them immediately, some of them days later, sitting in foxholes or in other field hospital wards, or in training camps or on the decks of ships, trying to articulate what the letter had made them feel. Some of them wrote about specific nurses they had been cared for by. Some of them wrote about what it meant to see an American woman's face after months of the front. Some of them wrote about the precise moment Frances had described, the lips separating into a grin, and recognized themselves in it. When the paper reported a week later that Frances Slanger had been killed on the same day she had written the letter, the response intensified. Soldiers who had already written wrote again. Soldiers who had not yet written wrote for the first time. An Army Air Force air gunner wrote that her memory would linger steadfastly long after the final gun was fired, and that she had pointed out the only genuine rule for peace on Earth: human love and understanding. The man who wrote those words was a gunner in an aircraft. He was not a person expected by the conventions of military culture to use language like human love and understanding. He used it because a nurse had written something from a tent in Belgium that had given him the words for what he felt, and he was not going to leave it unsaid. There is a specific irony in this that deserves a moment. Frances Slanger had spent months writing letters for men who could not write their own. She had sat by cots with a pen, asking what needed to be said and writing it down. The letter she wrote on the last night of her life was, in a sense, the same act in reverse. She was writing down for a world that needed to hear it the things that the men in those wards had not been able to say for themselves. The experience of being wounded and afraid and grateful and human in a field hospital in Belgium, the specific texture of what it felt like to open your eyes in a clean ward and see an American woman's face and manage to grin. She was their letter writer, and on that last night she wrote the one letter that could only come from her side of the pen. The women who did this work, all of them, not only Frances, but the 59,000 American nurses who served in the war, the gray ladies who wrote letters in the stateside hospitals, the Red Cross volunteers who sat by beds in England and France and Italy and the Pacific, were all doing the same essential thing. They were the presence that allowed the men in the wards to stop performing, to stop being soldiers for a few minutes, to be the person who needed to say something to someone, rather than the person who was required to function without needing anything. That is not a small thing. It is in the specific arithmetic of what keeps human beings capable of surviving extreme situations. Of American soldiers who were treated in the field died of their wounds, a rate so low that the Army's own medical historians describe it as one of the more remarkable achievements of the entire war effort, and attributed directly to the nursing care that met the soldiers when they came out of surgery and sustained them through the weeks that followed. Those numbers have a human face behind them, and the face is the nurse who got up when the ambulances arrived at 2 in the morning, who worked the shift that came after the shift she had already worked, who slept in the clothes she would work in tomorrow because there was no time or facility for anything else. The Army reported that fewer than 4% of the soldiers treated in forward hospitals died of their wounds. The number does not say what it cost to produce it. The women who served in those hospitals were nurses before they were anything else. Their identity was professional. Their training was technical. Their role was defined in medical terms. But the letter writing, the hand-holding, the sitting through the night with a man who needed someone to be there was not in the job description. It was not an assigned task. It was the thing that happened in the spaces between the assigned tasks, because the women doing it understood something that the job description did not capture. That the distinction between a man's medical need and his human need was not a distinction that existed in the ward, and that addressing the first without attending to the second was not actually addressing the first. The Gray Ladies of the American Red Cross, nearly 50,000 volunteers in the peak years of the war in more than 1,000 military and veterans hospitals across the United States, were the civilian version of the same understanding. They wrote letters, they read to patients, they played cards, they sat. They provided what the formal structure of hospital care did not provide, which was the ordinary texture of human company in a place that was, for the men in it, the furthest thing from ordinary they had ever experienced. One account from a Red Cross volunteer at a hospital in the United States where newly arrived wounded were being processed describes a young soldier who had been in the hospital for 2 weeks without once having a visitor. He had come from a small rural community with no family close by, no friends in the area, and no means of receiving the ordinary visits that other patients received. She began visiting him daily. Within a week, she was writing a letter a day for him, to his mother, to a friend from his unit who was in a different hospital, to a girl back home who may or may not have known he had been wounded. She described, in the account she wrote afterward, the change in him over those 2 weeks. Not a medical change. His recovery was proceeding on whatever trajectory it was proceeding, regardless of her visits. A change in his relationship to the experience of being in the hospital. He stopped staring at the ceiling. He started asking her questions about the letters she had written the day before, wanting to know if she thought they had said the right things. He was, she wrote, learning to use the pen as a way of not being alone. That is what the nurses and the volunteers and the gray ladies were doing across thousands of wards in hospitals on every front where Americans fought in this war. They were reducing the distance between the man in the cot and the people who loved him by the only means available: a pen, a page, and the willingness to listen to what needed to be said and write it down exactly. The war ended. The nurses came home. They came home to a country that was celebrating its heroes in the specific language it had developed for that purpose, the language of combat, of battles won, of ground taken, and enemies defeated. The ticker tape parades, the newsreel footage, the films and the novels and the songs, all of it was accurate and appropriate, and all of it described, fundamentally, the male experience of the war in its most publicly legible form. The women who came home, the nurses and the volunteers and the Red Cross workers and the gray ladies, came home to the same country and found that the country did not, for the most part, have a language for what they had done, not because it was unwilling to honor them, but because it did not fully understand what honoring them required, which was first understanding what they had actually experienced. And the experience was not the kind that translated easily into the available narratives. June Wandry came home in late 1945. She had 8 battle stars. She had followed the 10th Field Hospital across North Africa and Sicily and Italy and France and Germany, and had arrived finally at Dachau and had looked at what was there. She wrote in the diary entry that covered that day a single question: "Where are you, God?" And then she continued writing, because the diary was the thing she had, and writing in it was the thing she did. She spent years afterward largely outside the public record of the war. The memoir she eventually published, Bedpan Commando, was not the kind of book that found a large mainstream audience in the years immediately following the war, when the appetite was for the combat narrative and the institutional record and the strategic history. It found its audience later, gradually, among people who were interested in the part of the war that had happened in the wards and the tents and the spaces between the battles. Frances Slanger's story had a different trajectory, partly because she did not come home, and partly because the letter she wrote on the last night of her life had given the public a specific and tangible document to attach to the idea of what she had been doing. The letter was her testimony. The response to it, the thousands of letters from soldiers who had read it and written back, was their testimony. Together, they constitute one of the most direct records available of the relationship between the men in the wards and the women who sat by them with a pen. The hospital ship that carried wounded American soldiers home from Europe was named for her. The USHS Francis Y. Slanger made its first voyage in 1945 and brought men home across the same ocean she had crossed going in the other direction the year before. When her body was finally returned to Boston in 1947, more than 1,000 people came to pay their respects, including the mayor of the city. She was buried in the Independent Pride of Boston Cemetery in Roxbury, the neighborhood where she had grown up helping her father sell fruit from a cart. She had wanted to be a writer and a nurse. She was both in the end. The letter she wrote in the tent in Belgium was the piece of writing she had been accumulating the experience for her whole life, and she wrote it in 2 hours, in the dark, while the rain came down, the night before she died. The men she was writing about, the men who had come into the ward bloody and tired and asking for forgiveness and giving instructions and saying love in whatever way they could find. And on the other end of every one of those letters was a nurse or a volunteer or a gray lady who had sat with a pen and written down exactly what they asked. They did not have a word for what they were doing, not because the language did not exist, but because the work was so embedded in the ordinary flow of care that it seemed like simply what you did when someone needed it done. You sat down, you picked up the pen, you asked what needed to be said, and you wrote it down. Think about the shape of this story. a woman who grew up in a city that was being consumed by one world war, who immigrated to America as a child, who worked her way through nursing school, who enlisted in the army and crossed an ocean to follow a second world war through 4 countries across 2 years, who spent those years writing letters for men who could not write their own, finished her own life by writing one letter that said what she had been unable to say in all the letters she had written before it. And what she said, in a rain-beaten tent at 2 in the morning with the flashlight propped against the stove, was that the men lying in those cots were the ones who deserved the recognition, not her, that she and the other nurses were the fortunate ones for getting to be the people present at the moment a wounded soldier opened his eyes and managed to grin, that the mud the nurses waded through was not the mud they had to lie in, that it was we who were proud of you. She dropped the letter in the mail in the morning and was killed that afternoon by an artillery shell, the only American nurse to die from enemy fire in the European theater of the war. She never knew the letter had been published. She never knew the response it produced. She never knew that 1,000 people stood in the rain in Boston to receive her. What she did know was what she had learned in the wards, the specific education that comes from sitting by enough bedsides with enough pens in your hand, the understanding that the thing people most need when they are in pain and afraid and far from home is not primarily medical. It is the presence of someone who will stay, who will listen, who will pick up the pen and write down exactly what they ask, without judgment, without embellishment, with the full weight of attention that the moment demands. 59,000 American nurses gave that. Nearly 50,000 Red Cross volunteers gave that. The Gray Ladies gave that, in hospitals from Fort Dix to Pearl Harbor, in wards where men were learning to live with what the war had done to their bodies and needed someone to sit with them while they found the words for the people at home. The wounded do not cry. Francis Slanger wrote that. They do, of course. They cry in private when the lights go and brought into the ward. They held themselves together long enough to say what needed to be said. The pen was just the instrument. The thing it was writing down was the whole complicated human truth of what it meant to be very far from home and hurt and not certain of what came next. If you believe that the women who held those pens deserve to be as well remembered as the men whose words they were writing, subscribe. That is the whole reason this channel exists. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from today, because the further this story travels, the more these women are properly remembered.